Hello, I am Perella, a manager at Shellman, here to discuss understanding and delineating responsibilities with third-party service providers. We all use third-party service providers to perform all kinds of business functions, to include those in support of PCI DSS services. So for the agenda, we're going to talk about what you need to do to identify those services, understanding the responsibilities associated with those services being provided to your organization, how to apply controls around those, making sure documentation fits the bill appropriately, and then we're going to provide some additional guidance to help shore up any shortcomings or maybe additional considerations for your organization. So let's start at the beginning of this. When we think about the way that a third-party service provider can impact our organization, we need to think, what do they do? What are they offering for us? And while it's easy to try to allocate this consideration to a matrix that has been provided to you, it is often more nuanced than this. This requires your organization to understand the data that's being managed by the systems being accessed, understanding the sensitivity or severity of that data should it be compromised or through contractual obligations of your own to your customers, and any legal implications there might be should exposure ever occur. Access is not a binary, I have this and I don't have this, but also has to do with the privileges associated with those controls, to include any network managed exfiltration or input of data. However this works, your personnel that are responsible for interacting with these third parties or who are responsible for that data itself need to understand what this access is. So when going through this, identifying the access that these third parties have, the privileges that you need to give this to them, do they need escalated privileges? If so, how escalated? Should it be full administrative? The easy answer is yes, but in reality, probably not. How that access is going to be monitored, or how those steps are going to be monitored by your organization, and then the contractual language that needs to shore up. This is what they do for us. This is how we have contractually identified that, and then making sure that all of those elements align. As you can imagine, with all things in PCI DSS, everything needs to magically fit together like a giant, beautiful puzzle. And then understanding that these things can change over time. It is not atypical for a company to engage a third-party service provider and say, we're going to do service X. And then later on, that may increase or decrease based on the relationship you have with that business or your own needs. So this slide, we like to kind of tie some of these things together. Very genetic, but the idea here is that if you are leveraging the service of a managed service provider, then maybe they're administering, maybe they are administering routers, firewall switches, the networking of your environment. What access do they need? How is that logged? Do they need dedicated SSH keys? Are they leveraging a remote access through point that you manage? And this needs to be, again, identified. For custom software development, they need to be able to deploy code. Maybe your systems are calling out to their endpoints, in which case you don't even have to worry about access controls, but rather your communications with them to identify changes to that software, how they manage that software, because they're responsible for the testing and management of the code, right? The security controls that must be met before it is deployed into your environment. Hosting providers, the most common being Amazon, Azure, Google, Oracle, all of these are going to be responsible for the physical controls of your environment, but they probably don't have any logical access to that environment. So we are able to say they're responsible for making sure that nobody's going to get to the physical systems, but the logical access isn't there. And then we get a little bit further along in this slide. So log aggregation and alerting. Your organization may be leveraging a service to say, here are the severe incidents or notable incidents that require a review by your organization, or they're more low-level ones that service may provide for you. If they're providing that service for you, do they need access to make those changes within your environment? How much autonomy do they have to make that change? Again, all of this needs to be understood and documented. And then last, they have ones where you've got a CDN or a content delivery network or web application firewall, sometimes called a WAF. Who configures those? How are those configurations maintained? Does TLS, your encryption, terminate with that CDN and then re-encrypt it to you? Understanding this, understanding those responsibilities for them being able to decrypt something that may have your private key is an important consideration when it comes to both contractual responsibilities and making sure that your organization understands what that means moving forward. So we've talked about, now you've got a good idea of these services being provided. So this is almost always documented within a matrix. They've got all the requirements, maybe sub-requirements therein, and then it says something like, their responsibility, your responsibility are shared. This is great as a reference point, but it is important that any of the things that are provided in this matrix are backed by an attestation from that service provider, which delineates those services, at least by name, something that can be something where your assessor, something where your lawyer can point to and say, this is where we know that our service is being contractually identified. Because in the end, it's really being able to correctly allot responsibility for the controls that are protecting the cardholder data, which your organization is responsible for. And then we've got this little ultimately, who does what, when, and how. If there are multi-step parts of these services, such as creating a ticket to make a networking change, creating a request for a software development change, or an escalated ticket by a service provider that comes to you, where your organization needs to take the steps on what incident response measures are appropriate. All of that needs to be understood, and not just understood in a documentation form, but from a policy and procedural perspective. There should be no mysteries in the unfortunate event that something actually arises. So thinking back to the earlier part where we're talking about the access needed. So everybody wants to talk about role-based access control. Nothing new, fantastic concept, because it says you are going to have access to what you need to do to complete your job. Well, that may be the case in a very simple sense. You need to administer your database. No surprise there. Well, what if you needed access to a database that's also on a network segment that has other systems? Do you need access to those systems? No. Well, if I can access that database and the system it resides on in an administrative capacity, do I also have access to that same subnet? Was this managed through a centralized control where you get one user account and everything in the environment? While it is the most easy to administer, it is the most difficult to protect in that format. So thinking about what that access needs and then crunching it down to what is needed. Additional controls can be made, such as when that access is permitted. If everybody is almost always accessing your systems between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., well, those time constraints can be placed on there so that you do not have access coming at 2 a.m. Or if you do allow this to happen, maybe there's additional logging and alerting functions to say that a third-party service provider accessed 20 of your systems last night at 3 a.m. Maybe that raises an eyebrow. And then understanding how that is reviewed, you should need to actually have some sort of ongoing process to say, these are the third-party service providers who manage these functions for us. We are going to, on a quarterly, biannual, annual process, say, is this sufficient? Do they have too much access? And not atypical to work with the third-party service provider on that to say, what do you really need to do your job? Making it a conversational issue, but following through to make sure that those things are documented. Because data security goes beyond PCI when we think about reputation, other data elements you may hold with regards to HIPAA high trust, privacy obligations you may have to other parts of the country, like Europe with GDPR. Take the time to go through these considerations. Think about the data you're responsible for. And again, if there's any questions, you should always talk to your assessor and your legal counsel to provide any feedback on what steps to take next. So for monitoring third-party service providers, they have this access. There's logs, right? You're doing everything appropriately on that front. So if you go through there and this does not align, well, before you go tightening that screw, so to speak, contact that third-party service provider and make them aware. It would be a to the chagrin of everybody involved if you tightened down that access and they actually needed it to get their job done. So maybe what they need to do to provide that service for you is not correctly aligned with the contract, but in that case, update the contract so you can still have the work done appropriately. When monitoring third-party access that would be not following the normal route, right? The atypical access. Well, if they require third-party access to your environment, is there a multi-factor step that you can trigger to enable that access? The most common being somebody is working at their counter and a little pop-up shows up and it says, help desk or so-and-so of help desk is trying to access your system. Do you permit access? Well, hopefully people just don't click yes. There should be some sort of procedure which says that help desk should be contacting this individual. Maybe there's a ticket opened up or their manager sent them an email beforehand. Regardless of what that is, it needs to be known so that the granting of remote access is a clear process that has responsibilities, permissions tied to it to prevent unwarranted access or unfettered access to your environment or the data those systems hold. Because when we think about third-party service providers, that's their job. That's what they do. And in the concept of what we call a one-to-many attack, a service provider has a breach, and this reaches out to all of their individual customers, which tragic and severe. So if your third-party service provider only has access, a limited access, well, at least the exposure and your culpability as a service provider or merchant is easier to maintain. So incident response, right? The good old 1210 requirement that says when something goes wrong, this is what you do. Well, if you have a hosting provider, you need to know that they've got these things in place. As a hosting provider, they already have obligations for their compliance to be able to provide log data to you in support of any forensic investigation that may happen. Well, that's, fantastic language, but what actually happens when you need those logs? And the time to figure these things out is not after the fact. Have these conversations as a part of your annual walkthrough, or more often, hopefully, for that incident response plan. Contact those hosting providers, contact those third-party service providers and say, we're about to do this exercise. We want these logs for your access. Who did what, where, when, and how? And then if something doesn't fit the bill there, something doesn't align, follow through on that. And those same measures, this same exercise can be used to shore up any security holes you may have or gaps in your ability to monitor that access. Do the logs governing your systems, are they available to you? Can you get a full export of them? That is an important element. And unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way. So maybe your organization is, in addition to being able to offload logs, maybe you have your own central repository anyway. Maybe this is not so much of a space issue because it can be built into a cloud service program you have, or you have the space available to you. Even if it's just authentication, something that to start that investigatory step. So we've gone through all of this, and if you've gone through PCI DSS, you're very well aware of requirement 12.8, which says every third-party service provider I've got something written down that says what they do. And every 12.9 for the service providers out there, this is what we do for our clients. Well, these need to all marry up together. So when you're looking at a ROC, you've got all those requirements that say in place, this is what we do. For everything that is met by a third-party service provider or portion therein, those contracts, those details need to be really, really clearly defined. And while it is probably never to the full clarity that a QSA would like, there is a lot of improvement that can be found. And in our experience, it's pretty common for a organization to say, "You've been providing these services to us. Can you elaborate or clarify a little bit?" And there's a little back and forth, but it's usually done. And it makes things a lot easier from a, again, contractual perspective and delineating their responsibilities for the executive summary and the other parts of the report on compliance. As we mentioned earlier, the attestation of compliance is going to have those little snippets. If these services have names, it's great when they're in that attestation. If they're not, how is a QSA supposed to know that the service you are being provided to you, you are receiving, is actually covered by their attestation? It's not always the case. So that clearly listed or named service function is of incredible value there. And knowing, again, these change over time. So if a organization is growing, they acquire other systems, other services, how are these things being documented? Because when it all comes down to it from a legal perspective, that contract is where they're going to be looking. So I thank you for your time. If you have any questions, you want to talk about third parties, fill in the blank, reach out to us. We'd love to help.